Hello AP World History students, welcome back to our review session. So this review sessions will cover 1450 to 1750, which is roughly our units 3 and units 4. So as you're going through this video, just a reminder, please make sure you guys have your worksheets out with you to follow along with our key terms. Once again, we'll be dividing up these videos into little short videos for you guys to help you out. So this first video is going to be on the empires, some of the main empires that we really want to make sure you guys know from 1450 to 1750. So the first one I want you guys to know is the Tokugawa Shogunate in Japan. So remember, shogun is a word for military leader in Japan. For most of Japanese history, they lived in a feudal system, which basically means they had a lot of local lords ruling over Japan. They weren't really unified. However, with the help of gunpowder, some of those local leaders were able to start controlling more and more territory until eventually they had one unified rule by a shogun. The other big information I want to make sure you guys remember about Japan during this time period is that they rejected most European foreigners. There was some examples of them accepting some, such as the Catholic priests for the Portuguese and the Dutch, but generally speaking, they didn't have any interest in Europeans whatsoever, and also kind of suspect the Europeans really didn't have their best interests at heart. The image in the background, just to let you guys know, is one of the first images that we have of the Japanese portraying the Europeans. Although you can't really see the ship very well because it's hidden behind the words, I think it's always kind of funny because those Europeans don't look very European in this first painting. The next dynasty we got is the Ming Dynasty. So as a reminder, we talked about the Song Dynasty last unit, and then we had the Mongols, which was the Yuan Dynasty, and then after that dynasty, we have the Ming Dynasty. So one of the big characteristics I want you guys to know about the Ming Dynasty is the use of Confucianism. Now, if you recall, Confucianism, one of the big tenets of Confucianism is balance in society and basically knowing your role and knowing your duty. So one of the things that the government, of course, likes using when they're trying to centralize power is Confucianism. You need to know your role, and everyone needs to find it for societal harmony. And they even had those civil service exams, which would determine what role you'd play in the bureaucracy, which generally gives you a really good job. And in order to do well in those civil service exams, you had to study Confucianism and know Confucianism pretty well to actually do well. Another key term that's good to know for China is the tribute system. So tribute system is the idea where if you have one kingdom that's clearly better than all the other kingdoms, lesser kingdoms will go to them and then offer them tribute as a way of just acknowledging their superiority. China obviously considers itself the middle kingdom, like it's the center of the world and everyone should come to them, and they started reestablishing that. And for a very brief period of time, Zheng He, the explorer, did go around trying to reconnect with a lot of the former parts that used to trade with them. But that was very, after his death, was just disregarded. It was just a very brief period in Chinese history. And of course, last but not least, just like Japan, they did have foreigners, like the Europeans, start to show up at their shores. But they were very suspicious of those Europeans and tried to limit those Europeans to only certain districts. Because again, they don't want that European influence. Also because Europeans didn't really have anything that really interested them either. All right, next up we got the Mughal India. So let me make sure I get everything on here first. All right, so the Mughals, remember that stands for basically Mongolian. So this is kind of like they claim descent from the Mongols. And the rulers during the Mughal India were Islamic, but most of the people who are actually in India were Hindus. So you always had that kind of tension between Muslims and Hindus starting way back during this time period. And depending on what time period and what ruler is going on, sometimes the Muslims didn't trust the Hindus, and other times the government was open and did trust the Hindus to help rule the government. Some of the things you need to know, they had textiles and spices like tea. Textiles, of course, are hand-woven fabrics. That India was made that, of course, were considered more luxury items that especially Europeans would want very much and eventually sail around Africa to get to with Vasco da Gama. And of course, the last thing not least, I just want to reiterate, they do have the caste system. It's still very alive and well in the Mughal India. All right, next up, we got the Safavid Empire. This is in modern-day Iran or Persia. And the first thing we'll talk about is the divide in Islam between the Sunni and Shia. So these guys are the Shia. They believe in a literal interpretation of the Quran, where the caliph, the guy ruling, needs to be directly descended from Muhammad. Whereas Sunni, maybe a little bit more looser version of the Quran. Also, they do not necessarily say their leader has to be a descendant of Muhammad. And this caused a lot of wars, religious wars, with the Ottoman Empire right next door, who were Sunni, whereas they were Shia. And there was a lot of constant warfare going on between those two empires. The other big thing I want to point out with the Safavid Empire is that most of their economics was based on the Silk Road trade, which was very profitable in our previous unit, 1200 to 1450. But starting, Vasco da Gama was a little bit before 1500. The Silk Road started diminishing in power, especially when Europeans started sailing around and started doing more sea trade versus that land trade. And slowly but surely, that's going to result in the Safavid Empire falling apart. All right, so the next empire we're going to talk about is the Ottoman Empire. So let me just put everything out there again. So for the Ottoman Empire, where these guys are once again on that Silk Road, they are eventually the ones that are going to conquer the Byzantine Empire, which we didn't talk about in our review sessions. Where the Byzantine Empire is just the second half of the Roman Empire that still thrived in Constantinople. This image right here is it's a famous image, or a famous painting, I guess I should say, of the Ottomans taking down the walls of Constantinople, and eventually it's going to be renamed Istanbul. But actually, for most of the Ottoman Empire history, it was still called Constantinople. So they relied a lot on the Silk Road, because remember we called the nickname was they were the middleman of the trade. A lot of those items in the Silk Road eventually make it the Ottomans. The Ottomans can trade it out to Europe. And remember, this is one of the things that made the Europeans not so happy with the Silk Road, is the fact that this empire, this Muslim empire especially, was getting all these Silk Road goods and then trading for a much higher price. And it made Europeans want to do things like maybe get on a boat and explore the world and try to find a way around Africa to cut off the Ottomans. So religions, just real quick, they were Islamic, but they also did have a little bit of Orthodox Christianity, remnants from the Ottoman Empire, from the Byzantine Empire, and also a little bit of Judaism. Der Shirmei is something I'll talk about later on in a different video, but essentially that was the process when the Ottomans would take a bunch of Christian boys from the Balkans and use them in their bureaucracy to help the government run. All right, next empire we got up is the Songhai Empire. So remember, we talked about the Mali Empire earlier. So the Songhai Empire was much later on, and it's a similar thing to Mali overall. They still relied a lot on salt and gold for the trade and that trans-Saharan trade route. And they were mostly Islam as well. And the big thing we need to know here, especially our commonality thing about the use of gunpowder, Songhai was not an early convert to gunpowder, so they ended up losing a war to Morocco. And then I think in the late 1400s, late 15th century is when they get defeated and their empire dissolves. And what was going on during Europe during this time period? They decided, or they were mostly fractured, but they were starting to unify together in much larger centralized states like England and France in particular, and the Holy Roman Empire in Spain. But they were relatively not very wealthy until a guy by the name of Vasco da Gama was successfully able to sail around Africa and make it to India and prove that Europeans did not have to rely on Ottomans to get the rich trade goods and spices in the Indian Ocean trade. If you remember, the Indian Ocean trade was already existed pre-Europeans. It was really, they really just jumped in there with better naval technology, with better, basically cannons on their boats to be able to basically leech off the system and gain a lot of wealth that way. So they didn't really control India or even the ports on Africa. They really just had basically small little trading posts that they could just basically be basically pirates is what you could call them, and take it over. And that rivalry I'm talking about is where the traditional traders who dominated were Muslims. So there was this big rivalry between Muslims and Europeans that eventually Europeans will win out in the long run. But that, again, will take several hundred years for Europeans to really starting complete dominance. And the last thing we'll talk about today is joint stock companies. So this formation of these big, large companies, international companies, starts happening. And it's very common. You'll hear the British East India Company, French East India Company, even the Dutch East India Company. So these are so large companies, not one person can own it. So they have part shares in there that even the middle class can get owned in. And these companies eventually get so large they almost function as their own companies as well. Like the British East India Company will eventually rule most of India until eventually the 1850s when the Sepoy Rebellion happens and the government takes complete control. Two empires that do not actually form companies, or at least private companies, would be the Portuguese and Spanish. Main reason why is the Portuguese were the first ones into the Indian Ocean trade with Vasco da Gama, so the government tried to maintain complete control of that for the wealth. And of course, Spain is the first ones to South America and Central America, so their government takes a lot of direct control there as well, again, for the lots of wealth there as well. All right, that's it for our first video for this unit review. Please stay tuned for our next videos.